So I should probably just give some background. I've been working with administrative data sets for quite a number of years now, and I've been quite fortunate to have worked with a number of colleagues on a number of projects linked to the Data First initiative. And this is one of those kind of ongoing projects that I've had the pleasure of being able to talk to others about over the years. What I want to do is really just give you, I guess, a bit of background to this current piece of work. I should kind of acknowledge, I think, the project partners and also the funders of the project. It's funded by the Dawes Trust, and as Kate mentioned, we've been working in partnership with the Prison Reform Trust and also Russell Webster, an independent researcher, really to kind of develop this project, to co-design it very closely with the parole board. So they've been engaged really from the outset of this piece of work in terms of helping us define the kind of scope for the project, and also working with us when it comes to thinking about how we can co-design, if you like, some of the policy kind of recommendations that emerge from this piece of work. So what I'll do is really just give you a bit of a roadmap, if you like, of the ground that I'm hoping to cover this morning. So I'll just give you a little bit of background to the study itself. I'll tell you a little bit about the work of the parole board for those who aren't familiar with the kind of important role that it undertakes. I'll tell you a little bit about two of the key research questions for the project that are particularly relevant for this morning's talk. I'll then tell you a little bit about the kind of approach that we've taken as part of the project, and in particular the key data set that we've used for this piece of work. I'll also focus primarily on some of the key outcomes that are emerging from the project in relation to one of the key target groups of interest for the parole board, and that's those individuals who have been released following a life sentence in prison. But I'll also, for, I guess, baseline and comparative purposes, also talk about some of the findings for other groups of interest to the parole board, in particular those who have been imprisoned for public protection. I'll tell you a little bit more about those kind of sentences as we go on. And then I'll just end with some kind of, I guess, tentative implications from those findings, and also tell you a little bit about some of the next steps that the project team are undertaking with this particular data set. So this is very much a kind of work in progress, and hopefully I'll give you a much clearer sense of that ongoing work as we go through this morning's talk. So in terms of background and the kind of work that the parole board undertakes, again, for those who aren't familiar with the parole board and its work, it's a kind of important mechanism by which some of the most serious offenders are essentially risk assessed by the board to determine, once they've served a minimum tariff or term in custody, whether they can safely be released under probation supervision and then made subject to various conditions as part of a license condition. So the parole board is kind of central in that decision-making process. It undertakes independent risk assessments of eligible prisoners and then makes a determination about whether that individual can be safely released into the community or whether they should remain in custody for the protection of the public. I think what's interesting about the parole board is that despite the fact that it's been in existence for almost 60 years now, following its introduction in the late 1960s, it's widely acknowledged that we still have a fairly limited evidence base when it comes to understanding the processes of the board, the mechanisms, but also importantly some of the outcomes for the individuals who are released under the conditions of license that the parole board kind of agrees. And in particular, I think one of the kind of key elements of this particular study is that given the data set that we'll be drawing on, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that, we're able to measure these outcomes over the short, medium, and longer term. And I think that's quite unique in this particular area and space to be able to measure those outcomes in such a way. So in terms of thinking about the cases of interest, if you like, for the parole board, they include the following 5 categories of prisoner. So the first group is those who are serving a life sentence. The second group are those designated as IPP, so imprisonment for public protection. So this particular sentence was introduced in 2005, but subsequently abolished in 2012, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the background to the IPP. And today's presentation is predominantly focused on the outcomes that we've observed for life sentence prisoners, but also again for, I guess, comparative purposes, also feeding in some insights from our work as it relates to outcomes for IPP prisoners. The other areas of interest for the parole board are those prisoners who serve an extended determinate sentence. So this essentially will very typically be violent or sexual offences. And these have largely been introduced following the abolition of the IPP in 2012. So these became areas of interest for the parole board, in particular from around April 2015. Over a similar time period, we also had a cohort called SOPSI. So these are sentences for offenders of particular concern. And these will be those who've been convicted for terror offences and also offences, child sex offences committed against children under the age of 13. And then the final group or case of interest for the parole board are those releases where prisoners have actually been recalled for one of these offences for breach of their licence conditions. So again, the board will then make a determination about whether it's safe to subsequently release an individual who has been previously recalled to prison by the board. Another area of important work that the parole board undertakes is making decisions about the transition of prisoners from closed conditions into open prison conditions. So moving from category A, B, or C into a category D prison. Our research hasn't looked at that important role that the board undertakes, but we are looking at those decisions that have been made to release one of these kind of key groups, and also looking at the short, medium, and long-term outcomes that we can measure with the data that are available to us for this particular project. So we think that there are some quite important potential implications around theory, policy, and practice in terms of a focus on life sentence prisoners. So we're optimistic that this research can help inform our understanding of relevant theories as it relates to, for example, rehabilitation or desistance, for instance, looking at the effectiveness of life sentences in achieving their objectives, and also informing other kind of human rights considerations about how long individuals are being kept in custody as part of these sentences. There are also important policy implications, we think, in terms of helping policymakers better understand the actual risks that are posed by life sentence prisoners post-release. And that in turn can inform strategies to prevent reoffending and protect the public. And also from a more, I guess, practical or practice point of view, this kind of research can generate evidence to inform parole board policies, prison management strategies about preparing prisoners for release, and also post-release supervision of life sentence prisoners in the community. So in terms of some of the trends that we've been seeing in recent years for life sentence prisoners, we've seen a marked increase in the use and length of life sentence impositions. This is largely driven by the Criminal Justice Act from 2003, which increased both minimum terms and expanded the use of whole life orders. So the English and Welsh prison population is one of the highest in Europe, and that includes the life sentence population. We have over 7,000 prisoners in England and Wales serving a life sentence. And in recent years, we've seen a real disproportionate impact on Black and mixed ethnicity individuals. So to put the life sentence population in England and Wales into a European context, of the 53 jurisdictions that make up the Council of Europe, only Turkey has more life sentence prisoners. So Turkey has around 11,400 life sentence prisoners. The remaining 51 Council of Europe jurisdictions have between them around 9,400 life sentence prisoners. So there's a particular concentration, if you like, of life sentence prisoners across Europe in England and Wales. As a consequence of recent legislation, we've also seen an increase in the use of whole life orders. So these are individuals who are very unlikely to be released from custody. We had the latest figures suggest that there were 68 individuals serving a whole life order at the end of 2024. What this illustrates, I think, is that the overwhelming majority of life sentence prisoners, around 99% of them, will at some point come before the parole board, who will then make a decision about whether those individuals can safely be released into the community. So despite this large, comparatively large life sentence population within our prison system, there is a lack of detailed reoffending data for life sentence prisoners post-release. And we think this merely kind of underscores the importance of research like this to try and better understand the outcomes that are realized for life sentence prisoners and others of interest to the parole board. And this comes at a time when there are heightened conversations and a sharper focus on addressing issues like prison overcrowding and proportionality, but also informing public understanding of life sentences and also their kind of effectiveness and broader public protection concerns. So in terms of life sentence options, there are really three that we've been focused on and are of relevance to this particular project. The first is mandatory life sentences. So these must always be imposed following a conviction for murder. In these instances, the court sets the minimum term or tariff in terms of the number of years that must be served before someone can be considered for release by the parole board. The average minimum term in 2021 was 21 years, and that's increased quite significantly from the turn of the century, where the figure stood at 14 years on average for a minimum term. Once the prisoner serves that minimum term or tariff, they must still be detained indefinitely in prison until the parole board decides that they can safely be managed in the community. If they are released on license, they're then supervised by the probation service for the rest of their life, and they can be recalled indefinitely back into custody if they breach the conditions of their license. And the other two life sentence options that you need to be aware of are discretionary life sentences. So these can be imposed for serious violence, sexual or terror offences. The third option is an automatic life sentence, where this can be imposed when a person is convicted of a second serious offence. There are, of course, other important legal considerations that apply for discretionary and automatic life sentences. And this relates to issues like the seriousness of the offence, the perceived dangerousness of the perpetrator, and also patterns of previous offending. So whether, for instance, we're seeing an escalation in that offending pattern. So as I mentioned earlier, we have just over 7,400 people in prison serving a life sentence who've never been released, and around 4 in 5 of those life sentence prisoners are mandatory lifers who are serving a sentence following a conviction for murder. And just for context, I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that have been apparent with the use of the IPP sentence. So this again is another key group of interest to the parole board. And the reason I want to set this context is because, again, for comparative purposes, I'm going to be drawing on some of the evidence about the kind of short, medium, and long-term outcomes for IPP prisoners that we've been able to identify through the study. I think most people now recognise and probably would not argue with the assertion that the IPP legislation was poorly designed. It was created for high risk offenders, but issues with the drafting of the legislation meant that it significantly underestimated the number of people who would be I guess, captured by this particular sentencing option. So original estimates had suggested that 900 people would be affected, but there have been over 8,700 sentences imposed since their introduction in 2005. As a consequence, this put significant pressures on an already struggling prison system, which was unable to provide access to rehabilitation programs that were needed in order for prisoners to demonstrate a reduction in risk of reoffending or harm. And of course, this is a key consideration in terms of parole board eligibility criteria. We also then saw significant sentence inflation, so significant gaps between the tariffs that were imposed and the actual time that was served. And as a consequence of that, many people became and still remain stuck within the prison system. So figures published, for example, by colleagues in the Prison Reform Trust as part of their Bromley brief suggest that of the roughly 1,000 IPP prisoners who have never been released, 2/3 of them have served at least 10 years over their original tariff. 1 in 7 have served at least 15 years over their current tariff. And as a consequence, we've seen quite serious psychological damage being experienced by many prisoners who are serving an IPP sentence, including things like hopelessness, self-harm, suicide, and also levels of low compliance with prison regimes and lack of cooperation with the system. The European Court of Human Rights actually ruled that the IPP sentence breached human rights. They were subsequently abolished in 2012, but not retrospectively. So everybody who had received an IPP still had to serve that sentence unless it was removed on appeal or lifted by the parole board 10 years after an individual's first release from custody. There has been more recent changes in legislation. So thinking in particular about the Victims and Prisoners Act of 2024, which has reduced that threshold from 10 years down to 3 years, and also the obligation or the responsibility of the parole board to make the decision about whether it's safe to release some IPP prisoners. So there have been legislative changes that are currently in play, but these weren't available during the period of our study. So it's probably important just to put that into some context. So hopefully having provided some background to some of the key areas of interest for the study in terms of life sentence prisoners and IPP prisoners, what I want to do is just briefly move on to tell you a little bit about two of the key research questions that have been the focus of the project to date. So our first research question is concerned with understanding what proportion of life sentence prisoners released by the parole board from 2011 in England and Wales were subsequently breached or recalled back to custody, or were subsequently reconvicted for any further offence that led to imprisonment. So essentially we're referring to these as custodial reconvictions. The nature of the data set that I'll tell you a little bit more about in the next slide means that we're able to actually compare these outcomes across different groups and type of prisoner at different time points, so over the short, medium, and long term. Again, we do caution and caveat interpretations when it comes to comparing these different groups. They are very distinct in terms of the life sentence population relative to IPPs and the broader prison population. But again, we've kind of drawn these comparisons more for I guess, illustrative purposes, and also to set a kind of benchmark or baseline to try and understand or compare performance of life sentence prisoners against other groups of interest to the parole board, for example. And the second research question is thinking about whether there were any kind of associations between the characteristics of life sentence prisoners and these outcomes. So whether we're able to identify risk or protective factors for risk of breach or recall or custodial reconviction over time for life sentence prisoners using techniques like survival analysis, for example. So just to tell you a little bit about the approach that we took, it's essentially focused on secondary analysis of existing administrative case management data. So this is a de-identified and deduplicated extract of the Prison National Offender Management Information System, PNOMIS. So this is the case management system used by the prison system in England and Wales. This is made available through the Data First initiative, which Kate mentioned at the outset. I think one of the really valuable things about this particular data set is that it provides us with a census of all prison receptions and releases over an extended period of time. So for the purposes of this project, we had details of all receptions into prison and releases in England and Wales between January 2011 and September 2021. And that equated to 1.1 million release episodes. So the prisoner custodial journey level data set, which is available to accredited researchers and approved projects through the ONS Secure Research Service, is the data set that we have been using for this particular project. It provides us with a lot of rich information about offender characteristics, details about sentencing, information on the main offence that the individual was imprisoned for, importantly for tracking individuals' contact with the prison system over time. We have a unique offender ID that allows us to do that. And also information on the release status of the individual prisoner. So just to move on then to tell you a little bit about some of the emerging findings from the project, and just to give you a sense of some of the kind of key characteristics, if you like, of the life sentence cohort that were released by the parole board over the period that we examined. And we had a population of just over 3,800. So perhaps unsurprisingly, at the point of release, the life sentence cohort are considerably older than the general prison population at the point of release. So the average mean age of life sentence prisoners at the point of release is 48 years compared to 33 for the general prison population. What we observe over time is that the average age of all released prisoners actually increases from an average of 31 years in 2011 to 35 in 2021. But that this increase in age is more pronounced for life sentence prisoners over that same period. So from an average of 42 years in 2011 to 50 in 2021. The data set also gives us a picture of some of the other characteristics of the life sentence cohort. So they're predominantly males. That's a pattern that's more or less stable over the period that we had data for. Around 3/4 of life sentence prisoners on release self-identify as white. Over time, we see an increase in the proportion of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic life sentence prisoners being released. 89% of the life sentence cohort at the point of release are UK nationals. Again, over time, we see a modest increase in the proportion of life sentence prisoners who are foreign national. And in terms of the type of life sentence, 64% of life sentence releases by the parole board were for murder. And the trend over time is we see a slight increase in the proportion of life sentence prisoners who have been convicted for murder. So that stood at 69% in 2021. In terms of some of the other emerging findings in relation to breach and recall, what we observe is that life sentence prisoners generally have quite low rates of re-imprisonment for breach or recall. So at 1 year, we can track these outcomes for just under 3,500 life sentence prisoners, and they have a breach or recall rate of 3% at 1 year. And this increases to 10% for those individuals that we're able to track over this period of time. And again, I think one of the key benefits of this particular data set is it allows us to compare and contrast equivalent outcomes for different populations. And what we find is that for the IPP prisoner cohort, we have significantly and consistently higher rates of breach or recall at each of the follow-up points that we're able to measure. So for the IPP cohort, we have a breach or recall rate of 8% within a year, rising to 24% over 10 years. It's much more difficult to compare breach and recall rate for the general prison population. However, following provisions of the Offender Rehabilitation Act, it is possible to assess breach or recall rates for the general prison population, in particular for those individuals who were released from custody from February 2015. And the provisions of the Offender Rehabilitation Act meant that those prisoners serving a sentence up to 2 years at that point in time would be subject to a minimum 12-month supervision in the community post-release. And what we're able to identify with that particular cohort is that 2% of them are subsequently recalled back into custody within a 12-month period. So that suggests that the life sentence cohort is broadly consistent in terms of the breach and recall rate with the general prison population over an equivalent period of time. The other area of interest for us is looking at the rates of custodial reconviction. So again, we're able to track this for a cohort of life sentence prisoners at different time points. We can see that at 1 year, 1 in 20 lifers are re-imprisoned for a new offence, and this rises to 1 in 5 life sentence prisoners at 10 years. If we compare that to the outcomes observed for the IPP cohort, we see that 1 in 10 are reconvicted for a new offence and re-imprisoned within 1 year, and this rises to a third at 10 years. And what the Data First prisoner custodial journey dataset allows us, of course, to do is actually track equivalent outcomes for all prison releases over the corresponding period of time. And what we find is that around 1 in 6 prisoners are re-imprisoned for a new offence within 1 year. And this rises to just under half of all prisoners released in 2011 having at least one custodial reconviction over the 10-year follow-up period. So in terms of a comparative assessment of the performance of lifers and IPPs relative to the general prison population, we can see that they have much lower rates of custodial reconviction at each of the time points that we observe relative to the general prison population. And research question 2 was essentially concerned with looking at whether we could identify any risk or protective factors for life sentence prisoners in terms of their risk of breach, recall, or custodial reconviction over a 10-year period. And what we were able to identify was that compared to releases involving a mandatory life sentence, i.e. for murder, the risk of recall or custodial reconviction within 10 years was almost 3 times higher for discretionary and automatic life sentence prisoners. We also found that each year of increasing age at the point of release for life sentence prisoners was associated with a 7% reduction in risk over that 10-year follow-up period, but that the prisoner's sex, ethnicity, and nationality status did not have any bearing in terms of their risk of a custodial reconviction or a breach or recall over a 10-year follow-up period in terms of our multivariate analysis using survival analysis. So in terms of the implications of our findings, we feel that these emerging insights are perhaps indicative of the need for more adaptive and responsive forms of post-release supervision for some life sentence prisoners over the long term, in particular discretionary and automatic lifers and those who are released by the board having served a life sentence at a younger age. So is there a risk, for example, that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to the supervision of these life sentence prisoners? And if so, do we need to have some more adaptive forms of support and provision in order to cater for this particular group that we identify as being at heightened risk of recall, breach, or custodial reconviction over the long term? In terms of next steps for the project, we are currently undertaking an equivalent analysis relating to the other cases of interest to the parole board. So developing some of the work around IPP, also the extended determinate sentence cohort and the SOPSI group, as well as relevant recalls. So looking at outcomes for these subsets of prisoner releases that are of interest to the parole board over an equivalent period of time, and also undertaking multivariate analysis to try and identify risk and protective factors for these groups. Given that we are reliant upon administrative data, not surprisingly, we have identified some limitations and weaknesses within the data set. The key one being that there is no designated flag or marker for a parole case within the PNOMIS dataset. And we're also identifying a number of inconsistencies with the information, for example, that's recorded on release status. So we would anticipate a very small number of release conditions for life sentence prisoners, perhaps a handful at most. However, when we look at the PNOMIS dataset, we're identifying somewhere in the region of 24 release status types that are recorded, which again, we're having ongoing conversations with the data owners to try and understand and reconcile some of these apparent discrepancies. And of course, one of the, I think, key strengths of the project is the idea that we have developed this in partnership with the parole board and other colleagues within the Prison Reform Trust. So we are engaged in ongoing dialogue with them in terms of contextualizing the findings, co-producing policy recommendations, and also trying to, I guess, iron out some of the limitations that are apparent within the data set that we're using. Thank you for listening. I'm